Welcome back from our break. We're going to pick up again with our guest for the second session here on Hope in Los Angeles with Father Gregory Boyle, who we're very happy to have with us today. Father Greg is a Los Angeles native. If I'm not mistaken, he grew up in LA and even attended Loyola High School here locally way back in the day, and was also had spent some time at LMU as well. And after his Jesuit formation up in Berkeley, spent some time at the Weston School in Boston, and then finally made his way back to Los Angeles for ministry. But as he shares with us in his book, his first assignment was to go to Cochabamba-based communities in Bolivia, where he says he learned a great deal from the poor there, so that when he came back and was asked to be the pastor of the church in Los Angeles, it was the Dolores Mission Church, one of the poorest parishes in the city in Boyle Heights in 1986. After a few years of different experiments about how to minister to the community, Father Greg and his community and the church innovated what we now know as Homeboy Industries, which is the whole range of job opportunities, job training programs, and successful business enterprises, from Homeboy Bakery, Homegirl Cafe, the tattoo removal services, job training programs, silkscreen and embroidery. I think there's also, now we were discussing earlier before you arrived, the electronics disposal. There's just a whole range of things going on, and that we want to hear more about. It's the most successful gang intervention and prevention program in the world. It's a model that's been replicated now globally. You can look up all the various awards that Father Greg and his community have received for their work and their imagination about what is possible and how to make that real in the city in Los Angeles today, in now the 21st century. Father Greg is also the author of Tattoos on the Heart, 2010, The Power of Boundless Compassion, Barking to the Choir, 2017, The Power of Radical Kinship, which is really what we're very interested to hear about. And we read an excerpt from the kinship selection from Tattoos on the Heart, 2010. And I think you're working on another book now, but you can tell us more about that. So without further ado, first let's welcome our guest, Father Gregory Boyle. We have our little virtual hands. Okay. Father Greg, we were reading the preface to Tattoos on the Heart, in which you talk about learning from the poor in that early experience, and how that changed your perspective and changed your priorities and what you wanted to do in your ministry in LA. Could you just maybe begin there and tell us about how Homeboy got off the ground as something that might have seemed impossible, but that you, with your brothers and sisters in community, imagined as a possibility? And what was the interplay between learning from the poor and imagining something very different and something very new?
Well, thank you. It's good to be with all of you. And I have a third book coming out in October called The Whole Language, The Power of Extravagant Tenderness. So I was ordained in 1984 and studied at that point in Cambridge. And then I didn't know what I wanted to do for a living, even though I was a Jesuit and a priest. So I asked to go to Bolivia. I knew some Spanish, so right away I started to do ministry, and it kind of turned me inside out. I was supposed to come back and go to Santa Clara and kind of do their student immersion thing, where you try to get to expose students to contact with those on the margins. And so when I came back from Bolivia, I just couldn't do it. And I begged my provincial, please don't send me there. Nothing against Santa Clara. It's just that I knew that my heart had been altered by the poor. And I spoke Spanish. So it was like, please. So they sent me to the poorest place they had, which was Dolores Mission. I thought I'd be like the third priest on the totem pole, but I was the pastor, because it was a tough place. Pastors didn't last. And so everybody had like a 2-year stint, and then it was like, I'm out of here. So, and then initially what we did was really around immigration, the Immigration Reform and Control Act. And then we did a lot, and we started, we were the first church to declare sanctuary to include undocumented folks, not just those who are fleeing Central America. So, and then I started to bury kids in 1988. And we had 8 gangs at war with each other. And this was the beginning of the decade of death, which was 88 to 98. And this week I will have to bury 2 more, Tony on Tuesday and Robert on Thursday. And of course, if gang violence is about a lethal absence of hope, it shouldn't surprise us that gang-related homicides have skyrocketed, because we've been dealing with a once-in-a-100-year event that has messed with people's hope. So, and that's what we did. So everything was pretty reactive. I was on some Zoom yesterday with high school students who were asking, you know, what inspired you to do this, that, or the other thing? And I'm not sure there was so much inspiration as it was, there it is in front of you. I'm burying kids, sometimes 8 kids in a 2-week period. And it was alarming. So we just tried to, you know, put our heads and hearts together on it, you know. The thing with the poor is that they kind of lead you to put first things recognizably first, and assist you in you know, somehow living as though the truth were true. St. Ignatius of Loyola has a meditation called the 2 Standards, and it says in there, you know, see Jesus standing in the lowly place. And it's an interesting thing, because it doesn't say, hear Jesus tell you to get your ass over here in the lowly place. It's just see him standing in the lowly place. And it's non-judgmental, and it doesn't shake his fist at us, and it doesn't point his finger at us. It's an invitation to a place where you can experience exquisite mutuality, and where you can be changed. So I remember once a homie in Houston, a gang member who was working with gang members as a hardcore gang intervention worker, and I remember him asking me quite earnestly, how do you reach them, meaning gang members? And I found myself saying, well, for starters, stop trying to reach them. Can you be reached by them? And so the idea is, you don't go to the margins to make a difference. You go to the margins so that you can be reached. You go to the margins so that the folks at the margins make you different. And that was my experience in Bolivia, that I felt I was made different. And of course, I, you know, found myself steeped in liberation theology, in the dynamics of the base community methodology. So there was just kind of the air you breathed down there that you know, got to me. And it changed how I saw ministry. You know, at Weston, I was, you know, you could take courses everywhere. So I went to Harvard Divinity, and I took a course on ministry from Henry Nouwen and Parker Palmer, which is kind of incredible, you know, and they were amazing. But I remember a young woman asked Henry Nouwen, who was kind of not going through a great period at that time, and he ended up leaving Harvard, but and he found the L'Arche community right after that. But this woman asked him, what is ministry? You know, after all, what is it? And he said, can you receive people? And for me, that kind of unlocked the door. And then Bolivia kind of cemented my understanding. It's about receiving people. It feels very passive, but it's the opposite of passive. It's how everybody bridges the distance and the daylight that separates us. It's how we all inhabit our own mutual dignity and nobility, is by allowing yourself to be reached and receiving people. So it obliterates the notion that you're going to the margins to fix, save, or rescue, which is a helpful thing to obliterate.
One of the things you've been so successful at is, I mean, I think maybe many of us know the motto now from Homeboy: nothing stops a bullet like a job. That jobs, when you are in the margins and you're speaking with people, that they say this is what they need, and this is the sort of acceptance and autonomy and dignity that can have a transformative power. I'm curious about the all these different now enterprises you have going. Can you tell us a bit about the shape of things now currently? I mean, we know the bakery, I think the bakery was in Boyle Heights, now it's in Chinatown, and you have several other things going on as well. I was watching, I think some of us are all watching some different YouTube videos to get a peering inside, and there's a lot of activity going on. What's the sort of economic presence right now that you have in the city in terms of all the jobs and entities?
Yeah, I should say that we've been around for 33 years. So, you know, our T-shirt in the early days was "Nothing stops a bullet like a job," because we listened to gang members and they said, if only we had jobs. But I'd say 15 years into this endeavor, there was a difference between listening to them and knowing them. And as soon as we moved into that sense of knowing people, we said, oh, you know, it's about healing. So we really have shifted probably in the last more than 15 years. So the notion is that an educated gang member may or may not go back to prison, or an employed one may or may not. But then it became our absolute guarantee that a healed gang member will not reoffend, period. So we shifted how we did things. Doesn't mean we still don't, you know, supply, you know, employment services or run 9 social enterprises where rival enemy gang members work side by side, you know, making croissants or recycling computers at our recycling plant. That all that continues. But the healing piece, you know, so therapy, case management, navigators, groups, anger management. So the notion is that every man or woman who walks through our doors comes with what a psychologist would call a disorganized attachment. You know, mom was frightening or frightened, and you can't really calm yourself down if you've never been soothed. So if you, you know, use as a gauge the ACEs study, the Adverse Childhood Experiences study, and it's a scale of 10, and, you know, it's things that happen to you personally under 18 years of age, sexual abuse, physical abuse, neglect, and then there are, you know, environmental things like, you know, parent in prison or mentally ill, or there are 10 things. And I'm a 0, which says more about my own white privilege rather than my moral superiority. I mean, I won every imaginable lottery, you know, from zip code to parents to mental health. I won them all. And so I'm a 0 on the ACEs. And experts say if you're a 4 or 5, then you're going to have probably health issues and socializing issues. But every man or woman who walks through our doors at Homeboy, they're a 9 or a 10 on the ACEs, which is astounding, which leads you to stand in awe at what the poor have to carry rather than in judgment at how they carry it. So consequently, every gang member who walks through the doors comes barricaded behind a wall of shame and disgrace. And the only thing that can scale the wall is tenderness. So that has become the focus more than you know, let's train them to enter the workforce. Because once they're healed, they will leave us after, and healing ends in the graveyard, of course, but we call it essential healing or foundational healing. Then they leave us after 18 months, and the world will throw at them what it will, but this time they're not going to be toppled because they know who they are. So if it's true that a traumatized person is more likely to cause trauma, then it's equally true that a cherished person will be more likely to find their way to the joy there is in cherishing themselves and others. So that's become the emphasis that's so primary. In any comparable program in the United States has a menu of the same menu of services like we do, from GED to anger management to whatever. But it's the culture, it's the community of kinship, such that God might recognize it. It's the community, the sangha, as the Buddhists would call it, of practitioners, of beloved belonging, and that's the thing that is our secret sauce. And all the other stuff is good, certainly enemies working side by side. Mm-hmm. And then Homeboy announces a message. It's both solution and it's sign. And what if we were to invest in people rather than incarcerate our way out of everything? But also Homeboy wants to be the front porch of the house everybody wants to live in, where there's no us and them, there's just us. And so I'm happy with all the things we do and all the businesses, and we're a $25 million annual operation, and I'm really glad I'm not the CEO. I'm kind of just the cranky founder and emeritus, and all that stuff is good, but it's the culture that's so essential. And now we have this global Homeboy network where we have 300 partners in the United States and outside who have modeled their programs on what we do at Homeboy. But also not just gang members or even returning citizens, but also, other social dilemma, like homelessness and the mental health piece, and that they somehow know that if you create a place where people feel held and safe, then you can begin. So it's not about surviving as the fittest, but thriving as the nurtured. And so then that becomes the model of how we might, have alternatives to incarceration, how we might address homelessness, how we might be mindful of the mental health crisis that's truly a crisis, I think.
I hear you saying you have a lot of these operations going, but really what motivates them and the goal of them from the beginning and the end is this radical kinship, and then the healing that fosters. Can you tell us more about that? I'm thinking also of the phrase that Pope Francis is fond of, a culture of indifference, which is the opposite. But I know also in some Catholic circles, if I can be provocative for a moment, I'm sure you've had questions, I'm imagining at least, maybe in parishes where people say, there are circles of kinship. There's my spouse, my immediate family, my extended family, my friends and neighbors, my local community. There's a lot of conversations about what debts of love do we owe to those in our own nation versus those in another nation with respect to immigration. I mean, this is sort of very live questions about what circles we draw. And often this is when these questions of realism come in, which we discussed in our last session. You weren't there for, but sometimes when someone mentions something today as a proposal, it's often said, oh, that's too utopian, we need to be realist. Or if you say we need to have extravagant love, boundless compassion, and radical kinship, that's not practical and concrete. That's not sustainable. It's ideal, but it's not real. How do you describe radical kinship to people in ways that kind of break out of that concern about either the limits of our affections or realism and putting it into practice?
I often quote Mother Teresa, who says the problem in the world is that we've just forgotten that we belong to each other. So that's, the how do we stand against forgetting that we belong? And that's kind of the baseline. If you tolerate a notion that there are some people that actually don't belong to us, then we're goners. We can't make any progress, it seems to me. And that's your baseline. So and I also, in terms of kind of the faith perspective, there's nothing more consequential than our notion of God. And so, because it's going to call the shots and it will determine how you, so if your notion of God is exacting and judgmental and puny, then you're going to want to have people who are in and people who are out. I mean, I think inclusion is God. And so that's how you measure things, and so it's kind of, that's what we practice. We practice a sense of everyone belongs. How do you imagine a circle of compassion and then imagine nobody standing outside that circle? And there are no exceptions to it. And it's a challenge because we've been all brought up on a moralism that strikes the high moral distance, that really, and oddly, it's the opposite of the kinship that is God's dream come true, because it's distant. And the notion is, how do you bridge the distance? How do you ensure that there is no daylight that separates you? How are you utterly convinced that separation is an illusion? And how do you move beyond that? And it's tough. I mean, I think it's the most pronounced in my lifetime in terms of tribalism and all the things that we always talk about, But gangs have taught me everything of value, because, I found out early on that gang violence is about something else. And everybody is self-congratulatory when they want to address things head on. And I already learned that in the gang violence world. We are going to address gang violence head on. I said, good luck with that, because it's about something else. And so it's Daryl Gates, Operation Hammer, wipe them out, get tough. Good luck with that, because gang violence is about something else. And even when you had, conflict resolution and let's work with gangs so we can resolve this, I go, no, gang violence is about something else. And it's not about conflict. It has violence, but there is no conflict there. It's not about anything because it's about something else. And so you discover what the something else is, a despair that's really quite deep, a lethal absence of hope. And it's about trauma that's huge. And folks aren't able to figure out how to transform their pain so they don't have to inflict it anymore. And it's about mental health issues. So suddenly, if you want to deal with gang violence over here, you have to infuse hope over here. And you have to heal the trauma. And you have to deliver mental health services in a timely and culturally appropriate way. If you do that, the violence disappears. So we're not used to thinking that way. Even racism, even hate crimes. We will, we hate, or we're, decrease the hate. And I would say increase the health and watch what happens to the hate. I mean, my alma mater at Jesuit University, right after the Tree of Life Synagogue massacre, they started a seminar called Hate. And I remember thinking at the time, yeah, if they called it health, we'd probably make progress. But because you call it hate, it's immediately high moral distance. It's self-congratulatory. It says we are addressing this head on. No, you're not, because nobody healthy ever goes into a synagogue and guns people down. And you can call it a hate crime and you can call it anti-Semitic, but nobody healthy, whole, integrated, balanced, well, does such a thing. And the minute you strike the distance, you have upset the notion of kinship, because there is an us and there is a them. And moralism has never kept us moral. It's only kept us from each other. And I think Francis, you've mentioned Francis a couple times, and I think he's pretty good on that. You know, except for the recent, I don't call it I call it more from the Vatican than from Pope Francis. I suspect all these underlings pushed that thing through, and he went, "Whoa, what was that?" You know, and about God can't bless a sin, for God's sake. So, you know, sometimes we have to wait for the church, and sometimes the church waits for us. Anyway, I think kinship for me is God's dream come true, that you may be one. And the reason you do it is because there's joy. That's where the joy is. My joy, yours, your joy complete. And that's why you do it. And when we talk about the margins, you go to the margins because that's the only way they'll get erased. But it's born of the covenant where God says, as I have loved you, so must you have a preferential care and love for the widow, orphan, and the stranger. And in the society of the time, these are the folks society looked at and said, we can live without you. So kinship is to say, there's nobody we can live without. Everybody belongs. But as long as we have exceptions to that, it's hard to make progress as far as kinship goes.
This will be my last question. We'll open it up for questions for the group. So I'd like to see if you have a question, then raise your hand with the yellow icon, and I'd be happy to call on you then. My last question is, do you see, or where do you see some of the same problems that you've been working on in gang violence manifesting themselves in gang violence? Do you see those in other areas in our common life, in our political life, in terms of feelings of isolation or of trauma suffered, or of exclusions of different kinds that are leading to these sorts of violent expressions? Do you see the problem? How do you describe all the things that you've been working on for the last 30 years? How do you see them also outside of the particular instance of gang violence, or is this really something that's the most traumatic expression of these problems in cities that needs to be addressed?
Well, a thing I learned early on was, so we're 33 years in as an organization, but the first 10 years were really marked by death threats, bomb threats, and hate mail. And people, I remember I used to say that at talks, and people presumed I was talking about gang members. I go, no, never gang members. They always saw Homeboy as a place of hope for them, always. But the demonizing was so writ large at that time. And it was, it was a short hop to demonize me because I was helping gang members. And so in terms of progress, that stuff doesn't happen anymore. But it was really pronounced. Every day our mail had stuff that was alarming. every day I walked in and rewound that, whatever that machine was, the answering machine, and then played, and I braced myself to play these messages. And I think I mentioned in one of the books where somebody called and this homegirl was answering, and I can hear very professional, Homeboy Industries, how may I help you? Bring that bomb over here, motherfucker. That's right. Yeah. 1960s, whatever the address was. And it was like, and I said, well, who is that? Oh, it's some fool who wants to blow the place up. I said, how about God bless you and have a nice day? But that was a steady diet of that. And for the last 20 years and plus, no. So that's, for me, that's heartening. And I think that's sort of, but the lesson is demonizing is always the opposite of the truth. And it's the opposite of how God sees. And it's a notion and a truth that you have to hang on to, because we're endlessly demonizing. We're endlessly striking the high moral distance. And we have to catch ourselves, and so you can demonize Donald Trump as long as it's the opposite of the truth and it's the opposite of how God sees. And then you kind of go, well, what do I do with this? And you say, he's not well, and I have compassion for somebody who is not well and unfit to be president, but I have compassion for the fact that mental illness is real. And yet we think it's all about, we always think it's about, the devil. It's like Jesus, he sees it, and God loved Jesus, but he sees the guy having seizures and he thinks he's possessed by the demon. He demonizes him. And well, no, he has epilepsy. Here's a pill. But he thought that, and the audience thought that, and that's okay. But it's, it's not true. But it illustrates how we're always off when we demonize. And it's a good starting point, because the opposite of demonizing is insisting that we all belong. I was listening to George Saunders, the writer, on a podcast, and he said this thing. He said, kindness is the only non-delusional response to everything. And on the one hand, you can kind of, reflect on the kindness part, but it also is inviting you to acknowledge that every other response is delusional. And I found that kind of helpful. Self-righteousness, self-congratulation, arrogance, tribalism, every other response is delusional. But kindness, yeah, that's the only one. And I think it softens the soil so that kinship can happen, and you exclude nobody. And at Homeboy, that's the symbol. You stand with the demonized so that the demonizing will stop. You stand with the disposable so that the day will come when we stop throwing people away. You stand with the easily despised and the readily left out. You stand with the poor, powerless. You stand with those whose dignity has been denied, and those whose burdens are more than they can bear. That's who you stand with, so that the society at large will say, why are you standing with them? And you can say, because we belong to each other.
Thank you, Father Greg. Father Luke has a question, please. And I hope to hear from some junior fellows as well.
I was going to ask, what does cherishing look like in practice? But you raised, I think, part of the answer, or at least a very interesting practical response when you said making mental health services available. Can you tell me or say something about how that looks? Does it mean you know enough social workers and you know enough psychologists and you are able to enable people to find those conversations that can be healing as a kind of a first response?
Well, it's the relationship that heals. And the relationship happens in a culture of tenderness. And tenderness is the highest form of spiritual maturity. So that's where we want to land. And, you know, I was thinking the other day that cherishing is not a once and for all decision that somebody makes. You choose to cherish with every breath. Now, sometimes we think, well, I prayed this morning, and that's gonna propel me for the rest of the day to cherish. No, you choose to cherish with every breath. It kind of goes back to a thing that I found very powerful in that movie on Mr. Rogers with Tom Hanks. And Mr. Rogers is at a rope line and he's so attentive to each person. And the main character of the movie is a journalist and he's watching this and he turns to a woman and introduces himself. Well, it's Mrs. Rogers. And he says, how does it feel to be married to a saint? And she kind of makes a face and she goes, oh, I don't really like that word because it suggests that what he's doing and you see him being attentive and cherishing, it suggests that what he's doing is not accessible to people. And she goes, he's not perfect. He gets angry, but he works at it. It's a practice. And I remember watching that and those few words, you know, he works at it, it's a practice. It was sort of key for me. And I kind of went, yeah, you have to choose to cherish with every breath. And that's the context in which people heal. Now, you know, we have 5 paid therapists at Homeboy and 49 volunteer therapists, including 2 psychiatrists. So, and thank God, the homies are amenable now to therapy. They weren't when we began Homeboy, but they are now. And in fact, in the last 3 years, we've never had this problem, a waiting list, never. Because we never forced homies to do therapy. It's like tattoo removal. It's there. When you're ready, go ahead. But we don't force them. But now everybody wants therapy. So it's hard to, even with that many therapists. And some need meds. And some are bipolar and some are, you know, have really severe mental health issues, exacerbated often enough by their own self-medicating with meth and primarily with meth. Which is why we always drug test, because we don't want them to numb their pain. We want them to abide in it, to look at it, transform it, rather than keep inflicting it. So it's a kind of it's part of just the culture, you know, and the homies have so embraced this culture, and which is why we don't get toppled by bad behavior. You know, just on Tuesday, 2 guys threw down in the parking lot. And we know enough that violence is a language. So right away, what language is that violence speaking? And there's a homie named Robert Juarez who's like a wisdom figure there. And I remember once he said to me, you know what we got to do? We got to find the thorn underneath, which I think is brilliant, you know, because otherwise it's off with his head, and, you know, and unless you welcome your own wound, you're going to be tempted to despise the wounded. And so what you want to inculcate and foster you want people not to be strangers to themselves. You want them to be familiar with their brokenness and their wound, so that there's room in their heart for the broken and the wounded, which has implications for society because, you know, the largest mental institution on the planet Earth is LA County Jail. What does that tell us about how poorly we're dealing with stuff? And jails themselves are about punishing wound rather than healing wound. And so then you can turn stuff on its head. And then you imagine a country without prisons, and then you seek to create that place. You know, Wallace Stevens, the poet, says, we live in the description of the place and not the place itself. And we've settled for the description of the place. That's racist. That's however we label stuff. We've settled for the place, for the description of the place, when we should hold out for the place itself, which is not just kinship, but it's also an explanation. You know, why would somebody, you know, beat down an aged Chinese woman on the streets of San Francisco? If you settle for the description of the place, you just call it a hate crime. But if you hold out for the place itself, then you're going, this is about pain. This is about a human being who belongs to us. This is about mental illness. This is about anguish for which we're invited to be compassionate. And suddenly you've allowed for kinship rather than shut the doors to it.
And I know you said at the beginning that you passed on the job to work with college students and to show them opportunities for immersive learning, but maybe just with a sense of humor, we can return to that for a moment. We have our group of college students here. What are some ways that, I mean, I'm thinking of this enterprise, Homeboy, and your ministry has been an exercise in this very successful utopianism. And part of what I find so heartening is that it has been going for 3 decades. And so this question about will that ever work sort of answers itself, and it then invites us to consider what was the sort of change in perspective that allowed you to make that step. So for our students who are working through education now or trying to see the world in different places, what are some things that foster, you spoke about the experience in Bolivia, but what are some things that foster your imagination and that capacity to see something completely different than you saw before, to see the same thing in a very different way, to see something in a way that allows you to take the risk of imagining it in a different way? Is there advice you have for young people seeking to learn to see in different ways in their own education at a deeper level beyond just the classes?
Yeah, you know, I think Brian Stevenson talks about get proximate. I would say, I always say vicinity. How do you get yourself in the vicinity? It's sort of see Jesus standing in the lowly place. And so, you know, we have 300 volunteers at Homeboy, you know, in pre-pandemic fullness. And, you know, doctors and therapists and tutors and even high school students and college students who do immersion programs, that kind of thing. And the younger ones will always say, so what am I going to do here? And I always say, no, that's the wrong question. What will happen to you here? And you want it to be open to exquisite mutuality. So it's not let's go to Tecate and build an orphanage. And there's nothing wrong with that. But it's a different thing. It's putting yourself in the vicinity so that your heart can be altered. And in the process of that, you know, everybody is holding up the mirror to each other. And the homies always say, we're used to being watched. but we're not used to being seen. So it's an exercise in that, or what the Buddhists say, "Oh, nobly born, remember who you really are." So that happens at the margins in a dramatic kind of way, you know, where people see each other, and it's an erasure of the margins, and people are moving closer and closer to each other, and that you may be one, as Jesus says. And the union is really not even with God, you know, because God is too generous and self-effacing. You know, it's kind of like, you know, the original covenant isn't, "As I have loved you, love me back." No, it's other-centered, it's loving-centered, it's kinship-centered. It's God saying, "No, it's not about me, it's about us." And so if you go to the margins to make a difference, it's about you, and it can't be about you. But if you go to the margins so the folks there make you different, then it's about us. Then it's about kinship. You know, question I always get asked is about burnout, you know, and it's funny, I did 93 Zooms this week with students, you know, and at every level, and faculty and those kinds of things, you know, and they always ask about that. And I'm terrible on that question, because I kind of don't believe in self-care. Of course, all you'd have to do is look at me and know that that's true. But, you know, yeah, get sleep. Yeah, go for a walk. Yeah, call a friend. If you're burning out at the margins, it's because you're doing it incorrectly. It's because you've allowed it to become about you. And it can't. And it will be depleting, because then it's about success, progress, outcomes, and you'll burn out. And you deserve to burn out. But if it's about us, and if it's about love, and if love is your goal, then failure doesn't exist. It's sort of meaningless. What does that even mean? And Mother Teresa says we're not called to be successful, we're called to be faithful. So then you're faithful to that, and you delight in the person in front of you, and it's eternally replenishing. Now, I learned that the hard way, and I wrote a story about it in Tattoos, about the kid and the light switch. He had this dream, and long story, but I realized that only he could turn that light switch on it. But I had a flashlight, I was pointing at the light switch. But my own burnout came because I was trying to turn the light switch on for gang members in the projects in Boyle Heights. And as soon as he told me that dream, I stopped. I mean, I've never had an experience like that, where it was instantaneous. I went, I'll never do that again. And I didn't. And it shifted for me. And have I been close to burnout since then? No. And people will say, my God, you know, you've buried I've buried 200 this week, it'll be 245 and 246. I keep track because those lives matter. And people will say, oh my God, it's so hard, and how do you do it? And I go, eternally replenishing, because you delight in people, and you allow your heart to be altered by the poor, and you stand at the margins, and you know the margins are getting erased just because you put yourself there. And it's not about me. That's why it's eternally replenishing. So that's the advice, you know, and that's, I always feel fraudulent when people go, oh my God, it must be so hard. And I go, oh God, it's not. It's eternally replenishing. It's where the joy is. And that's the best kept secret about standing in the lowly place, is that that's where the joy is. And every single one of those 300 volunteers at one time or another have passed by my office at Homeboy and have just stuck their head in. And they said, this place has changed my life. Yeah, which is to say, it's where the joy is. It's not about what you've accomplished or people you fixed, saved, or rescued.
Anna, you had your hand up. Would you like to ask a question?
Yeah, I just had a question about so like in your book you were using a lot of images like God wants to dance with you cheek to cheek and he can't take his eyes off of you, or like he wants to drop rose petals on your head. And like that kind of makes sense, but I was wondering how you convince other people of that, especially people who you worked with who didn't like receive that unconditional approval in the past. And like also, by the way, like how do you know how God thinks of people?
Well, you know, I have a friend, Mirabai Starr, who's a mystic, and she writes about mystics. And she says, once you know the God of love, you fire all the other gods. And I don't, you know, you invite people to know the God of love. Then pretty soon all the tiny, puny, mean-spirited gods go by the wayside. You know, the ones that are judgmental and exacting. The God who thinks you're not enough, or you're disappointing, or I sure wish you'd measure up, fire that God. And people only know God by finding people who have you know, for me it's the dynamic of receiving the tender glance from God and then being that tender glance in the world. It's the notice of God, and then you notice people. I mean, it's that dynamic. And it's choosing to be in the world who God is, compassionate, loving, kindness. And that's how people know who God is. And then in terms of like Christianity, you know, Christianity is something you do. It's not an adherence to a bunch of ideas or beliefs. It's something you do. It is indeed a way of life. And then people see you. I'm reading a book by Richard Rohr about St. Francis called Eager to Love. And that's exactly how St. Francis operated. It was like, I'm going to be in the world who God is. And people found it compelling and attractive. You know, and that's the hope. So, and the mark of an authentic person, but certainly an authentic Christian, is joy and bravery. And of course, the opposite of that is fear and sadness. And you can, you know, read things, and you can even read the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, and like their 4 priorities, they're soaked with sadness and fear. And you go, no, when it could be brave, and it could be fearless, and it could be joyful. It's not, it's all circle the wagons, and it's very defensive, and that's too bad. Because that's not the marrow of the gospel. The marrow of the gospel invites us to joy and bravery. And it's funny, you know, you have Jesus in a resurrection appearance in the locked room, and all the disciples are trembling, and they have 93 chains on the door, and he gets in, and then cut to Thomas coming in, and they say, wow, Jesus came. And, you know, and we talk shit about Thomas because he's doubting. You know, it's like, unless I can put my fingers in the wounds. Newsflash, Thomas wasn't in the room. He was outside. He was in the streets. He was not naive about, you know, the dangers. But that's my image of Thomas anyway, with his sleeves rolled up, brave and joyful in the streets. He's not in that locked room. And the church can become locked in the room. And we can't be. We have to be outside in the streets, joyful and brave. And, you know, again, sometimes the church waits for us and sometimes we wait for the church. But what do I know?
Daniel.
Hi, Father Greg. I had a quick question. I was interested about how you began like integrating this message of healing into like the community once you arrived in like Boyle Heights and the larger East LA community. How were your first interactions with homies? Like, how did you first try to connect with them and ultimately achieve homies like believing in this idea of healing? Like, what was that process like for you early on?
That's a good question. You know, it was probably slow, you know, and there's nothing immediate. And the homies thought I was a narc because I was a white person walking in the projects. And the cops thought I was, you know, a customer walking in the projects and they would pull over until they found out who I was. And what are you doing here? I said, well, I'm the new pastor and I'm walking in my parish. I wouldn't recommend it, was what one cop said. And because I was white and walking in the parish, clearly I was there to score some crack cocaine. That's would have been the presumption. And so there was nothing immediate, but I think I mentioned in the book how, you know, advice I got as a first day teacher was know every name by tomorrow. And it's more important that they know you than that they know what you know. And the idea of that is it's the relationship that heals. Unfortunately, you know, we kind of disqualify ourselves. You know, I'm a white guy, and it was mainly well, hugely 95% Latino. And the other percent was African American. And then it became 99% Latino. After the Bill Clinton one strike and you're out, and pretty much folks were evicted right and left from the projects. But so we think, you know, if you're the proud owner of a pulse, then you can connect to people. You don't have to be, people were always disqualifying ourselves. And, you know, I'm white, and so I can't really connect. I go, no, this is a human thing. And that's why it works. So in the early days, I can remember being around a table often at you know, with hardcore gang intervention workers, African American and Latino. I was the only white guy. And they had respect for me because they knew I was kind of, you know, in the field, you know, on the streets. So they were okay with me. But then push would come to shove, and they'd kind of say, Padre, you know, con todo mi respeto, we think gang members will listen to us more than they will listen to you. That always came up. And I would say, I think you're right. If the task is yakking at gang members, but since the task is listening to them, receiving them, allowing your hearts to be altered, letting them reach you, if that's the task, then if you're the proud owner of a pulse, then you can do that. And that's what's exciting, is not to make it rarefied and specialized. So you don't allow anybody to say, step aside, let me handle this. No, this is a human thing. That's the point of kinship, is that we are connected. At Homeboy, we say love is the answer, community is the context, but tenderness is the methodology. it's what keeps love from staying in your head or your heart or in the air. It makes it connective tissue. And that's why you do it.
Mary.
Hi, Father Greg. Just thank you for everything you've said so far. I study, I do a bit of work in epigenetic trauma, and my research lab. And so especially in marginalized communities, just thinking about how trauma affects DNA and it goes through. And so, but also being Catholic, I've run into a lot of problems, not want to say problems, but interesting conversations balancing like, I'll pray for you, or the need to lean on God, the need to like lean on your faith versus like mental health, like chemical imbalances, actual science, and both exist. How have you guys have obviously integrated both? I've just wondered about like, I don't know if there's been any challenges. How do you manage like the need for like adoration and prayer? There's like the ministry side, and then the, I don't know, I want to say like science, mental health, medical side of things, or if you've run into like, I don't know, any problems with, I don't want to say like, just with people in the church who lean more on prayer than science.
Yeah, people presume because I'm a Jesuit priest that there's some kind of indoctrination or proselytizing that happens, and it doesn't, because we have Muslims, we have Buddhists, we have atheists, we have every variety of involvement in Christian sort of beliefs, including Catholics. So we kind of don't go there, and we believe in the science, and we believe in that tenderness and cherishing can actually alter, your brain. And we've seen it happen, in palpable, extraordinary ways. So we kind of want to cut through, once you know the God of love, you really have to fire the other gods. So, this happened at the beginning of the pandemic. I remember homies would, they'd come in, and again, I was telling David that we were open. We were closed really for the first 3 months, but we were open after that. But it was protocols, temperature, masks, distance. And homies would come and they would refuse to wear a mask, and I'd ask them and they'd point to the sky and they'd say, because I believe in God, I trust in God. And I'd say, well, then how come you own a gun? But that's beside the point. But I want to say, no, fire that God. That God doesn't exist. The God that thinks you shouldn't wear a mask. Nonsense. And we're going through this right now with vaccines, which is fascinating to me because I did kind of an informal study one day, and I think there were 8 homies, and they'd come in about one matter or another, and I'd say, hey, are you going to get the vaccine? 6 of them said, oh, hell no. Bill Gates put a microchip in it. It'll alter your DNA. One guy said, it's the sign of the beast, which I don't even know what that means, Everyone said, 6 of them said no, and 2 of them said, of course I'm going to get it. Now, if I were to go to my staff and lay out those 8 guys, and they were all guys, and you'd say, who are the guys in this group who have done the work? We always call it do the work. Who are the guys who have come to terms, who have transformed their pain? Who are the ones who have surrendered to healing here at Homeboy Industries? The knowing senior staff, mainly homies, they would say that guy and that guy. And they would pick out the 2 guys that said, of course I'll get a vaccine. But the other 6, they're not stupid. They're not ignorant. They're not yet whole. They still are strangers to themselves. They aren't yet fully healthy. or well, and that's okay. But I think that's a correct diagnosis, that it's about that we're invited as mystics to see wholeness in people and to seek it, to be whole, well, and that requires science. But, you know, we kind of look at resistance. You know, a third of the military will not get vaccinated. That's the description of the place. But what's the place itself? It's because they're not yet whole, and they're not well, and they're not completely integrated. It's not like they're stupid or ignorant. I think that's important, because then you find the thorn underneath. And then it's of course it's more allegiance to science, because I think that's what God would have us do.
Thank you. Let's go to Andy for what might be our last question. We'll see how things go. Go ahead, Andy.
Sorry for taking the last question, but hello, Father. My question was, so I watched your YouTube video about the Hilton Prize, and it was just like beautiful. Like, I'm not ashamed to say that I was like crying by the end of it. It was a beautiful message about like kinship, about healing, about being with the other. But I couldn't help but thinking right now, is there any like negative aspects to like being like closing that gap from you and the other? Like, are there anything, I don't know, like, is there anything that like negative about that? Like, because these people that you sometimes see as the other or as damaged people, sometimes, like you said, damaged people want to damage others. So I don't know. It's just a weird question. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I can remember years ago, a probation officer who I was very close to, and she's since died, and she was a sweetheart. But I remember once she said to me, "Oh, you know that guy Louis? Don't even try with that guy. That guy is pure evil." And I knew, of course, she was wrong, because I knew Louis. And then you kind of, again, you hope to have the mystical view that sees the whole person. And that's the hope, because once you do, you don't get tripped up by behavior or what a person does. It's not dark in the sense that it's a deal breaker. Again, I have a hard time with sin and evil, only because I've worked with gang members for 37 years. And I've never met an evil person. I've never met an evil person. And if you think you have, it just means, you've allowed yourself to embrace an unsophisticated take. When we call people evil, it means we're not even trying. But imagine if we were trying. And that's why, Andy, there isn't a kind of a negative piece to that, because it's all compassion. It's all kindness. It's all the mystical view. And I'll just end with this. My editor and agent and publisher always hate my titles, but I always have to hold out for them. And the titles always come from homies. And so the whole language is the title of my next book. And it comes from a homie named David, who I testified so they wouldn't deport him to Uzbekistan, because he came to this country at 9 years old with his mom. They settled in a Latino barrio, and he got into a Latino gang. And then he did like 5-year stint in prison. And then when he got out of prison, ICE held him to deport him. Anyway, they let him stay here. But I came back from the federal building and I see a homie named Louis and asked him, and I knew they were from the same gang. I said, do you know this guy? And Louis says, oh, that's my dog right there. We call him Russian Boy. And check this out, he says, we were cellies at county jail. And every night he'd go out into the hallway on the payphone and he'd talk to his mom and he talked Russian. And then he says to me, damn, G, he spoke the whole language, which cracked me up because it was his way of saying he was fluent in Russian. But then I thought, the whole language, that's what awaits us. That's what makes a utopia of our current real world and country. It's about, if we can speak the whole language, then it's the mystical language. It's the language of the God of love. It's the knowing you have to fire all the other gods in order to kind of stay anchored there. And it's about seeing wholeness and finding the thorn underneath. It's about somehow seeing the entirety of the person so that we can all walk each other home, as Ram Dass says. And so that's the hope. And the whole language is about tenderness and about choosing to cherish with every breath. You work at it. It's a practice. It's exactly 12.
Thank you, Father Greg. That was exquisitely timed. We're really grateful for your presence and for those words of hope and what's been a tough year, but hopefully we're emerging out of some of the worst of it. And we will just have to postpone our visit, but not put it off for too long, to come up to visit you at Homeboy. And maybe that would be a good venue for our social reunion. We've been looking for one, because I hear you sell some good bread and sandwiches too, I assume.
That's right. We'll see you guys there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you for being with us, and it's good to see all of you. We will keep in contact, of course, on email about practical things, but also to keep in touch so we can all see each other in person, I hope, in the not too distant future. But thanks for sticking in there for what's been a long year, but I hope a fruitful one here in the Nova Forum with our seminar together. And I hope we can all keep in touch and stay connected in our programs, some of which I hope will continue over the summer and some of the colloquia, and then looking forward to next year as well. So thank you all. I'm going to bring the recording to an end, but I'll stick around for a few more minutes if anyone wants to speak. Thank you.